Ladies and gentlemen, if the interpreters are ready, could I see a thumbs up? Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, we're about to start. I'm going to issue my personal welcome on behalf of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And without further ado, we're running a little bit late, so I'm going to invite Ambassador Albert Ramdin, Assistant Secretary General of the Organization of American States, to give us his introductory opening remarks. Ambassador Ramdin.
Good afternoon. I wasn't sure if everybody was with me, but good afternoon. Distinguished ambassadors, representatives of member states, Commissioner Rosemary Bell-Antoine, our feature speaker, Dr. Sheila Walker, specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, and of course the members of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission Secretariat. Let me start by saying this. In my office hangs a very large picture of a great man. Those who have been in my office know what I'm talking about. But that man once said, and I quote, "There is no easy walk to freedom anywhere, and many of us will have to pass through the valley of the shadow of death again and again before we reach the mountaintop of our desires." End of quote. Mandela. This week, headlines around the world tell us that this man who changed the course of history, not only in his country but also in the world, is in critical condition in hospital, following a lifetime of unprecedented achievements, which began with momentous personal and public struggle. The man I'm speaking about needs little introduction, of course, because, and this is important, he decided not to remain invisible. As millions around the world say a prayer for Nelson Mandela and his family this week, I say with certainty that this great man is the very definition and essence of the theme that you have chosen for today's meeting, transforming the invisible into the visible. This lecture series is very dear to me because I'm a Caribbean national. I come from a region where African heritage and influence has shaped who I am, how I live, and what I strive to be. My own country, the Republic of Suriname, is arguably one of the most ethnically diverse nations in the Americas. It's a place where Afro, Indo, Asian, Dutch, and the Maroons have lived together in harmony for as long as I can remember. It's a place where historic discrimination was gradually but successfully replaced by shared experiences, joint challenges, and generations living in harmony and in brotherhood. My personal encounter with discrimination towards me and my Afro brothers occurred when we as students left the safety of our homeland and became a part of what felt like the unwelcome invisible. My experience left me with a firm belief that discrimination is among the most repulsive forms of human behavior, slicing away at human dignity and hurting the very soul. None of us in this room can say that in our lifetime, to one degree or another, we have not personally experienced or witnessed acts of discrimination. This issue is an open wound and a festering sore which has not healed. This hemisphere and the countries of the Americas were largely built on the backs of those who were considered unequal. Discrimination, therefore, is a deep-rooted issue, and its fruit is still evident. As United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon pointed out, we cannot continue to accept that whole communities are still discriminated against because of the color of their skin. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights, remains our mandate. Ladies and gentlemen, last year the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights issued a report on the situation of the people of African descent in the Americas. In essence, the report confirmed that Afrodescendants in this hemisphere continue to face major obstacles. and are deeply affected by the persistence of racism, multiple levels of discrimination, and the links between poverty, race, and social class. The unfortunate reality, however, is that while many countries recognize the problem, discrimination is often built into an environment and becomes structural. A fundamental overhaul in thinking, perspectives, and paradigm is sometimes required, and this in turn requires courage and political will. The shift in thinking, however, continues to gain momentum, as evidenced by what happened a few weeks ago at the OAS General Assembly in La Antigua in Guatemala, where several member states embraced the adoption of the Inter-American Convention against Racial Discrimination. And I must say here that the leadership of Antigua and Barbuda in that regard should be recognized, and I'm happy to see Ambassador present here. The adoption of the convention, however, ambassadors, must not remain stagnant. Our leaders and our people must go beyond agreeing to the precepts of the convention and translate it into tangible actions by developing and implementing laws and thoughtful social policies, public policies which promote equality, opportunity, and a level playing field. Both the OAS and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights have been dedicated to increasing the visibility of this issue. The rapporteurship on the rights of people of African descent and against racial discrimination is a mechanism that is over 8 years old, has worked to develop case law in this area. Its mandate and work, inspired by the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, focuses on access to and equality in justice. People like Sir Claire Roberts, Maria Sylvain Gillen, and now Rosemary Bell-Antoine, who joined the Commission last year, have demonstrated dedication and commitment and continue to achieve results by ensuring the visibility of this issue. Working with these agencies, we must intensify our efforts in drawing attention to the challenges faced by the significant percentage of our hemisphere. Approximately 200 million people of African heritage live in the Americas. That is 30% of the population of this hemisphere. They have faced inequality, marginalization, exclusion, and social injustice. Yet they have defied the odds, broken historic ground, and the world has benefited from their accomplishments. I saw a prime example of this a few nights ago when we brought together close to 300 people at the Hall of the Americas to celebrate Caribbean Heritage Month. Among us were doctors, inventors, lawyers, politicians, and one in particular, Dr. Una Clark, who started off as a Jamaican student immigrant and went on to become the first Caribbean to be elected to the New York City Council. Ladies and gentlemen, transforming the invisible to the visible is not just possible. I see it as a movement and a concept that must grow and spread. I'm particularly pleased that the first lecture in this series features Dr. Sheila Walker, and I had an opportunity to exchange a small conference on Suriname already. So I can expect a lot coming from Dr. Sheila Walker, renowned African-American cultural anthropologist and filmmaker. I believe history is important because it gives us the causes to recall our strengths and gives us courage. So in closing, let me reiterate that I remain committed to keeping this issue high on the political agenda of the Organization of American States with the support of the member states. And although the road ahead is long and the challenge is wide, others have gone before us to lay a foundation upon which we can build. So all I can say is, let us build. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ramdin. And now I turn over the proceedings to the rapporteur of the rapporteur on the rights of people of African descent and against racial discrimination, Professor Rosemary Bell-Antoine.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As the rapporteur, I have the distinct pleasure and honor to welcome you all on behalf of the rapporteurship on behalf of our human rights specialists who did all the hard work in organizing this event, Hilaire Sobers, and indeed the entire commission. A special welcome, of course, to our esteemed ambassadors, to our friend who took time off to come and be with us here, Assistant General Ahmed Ramdeen, and of course our distinguished guest, Dr. Walker. I want to thank you for your demonstration of what really is a commitment to this very important issue by just attending the event. So we consider this lecture series, Transforming the Invisible into the Visible, to be a significant vehicle in addressing one of the most pressing issues highlighted in the Rapporteurships 2012 report, which Ambassador Randy mentioned previously, and which spoke there about the invisibility of the issue of race discrimination as it concerns peoples of African descent, and saw its aim as increasing visibility and supporting the ownership of human rights by persons of African descent in the Americas, to their strengthening and to give persons of African descent a tool for empowerment. So it is clear the question of invisibility means different things to different groups of peoples of African descent, different shades of invisibility. At one end of the spectrum, where we have, for example, Afrodescendants in the majority, as in the Caribbean, equality has been a historical goal, but at this time, the debate has been somewhat diluted, perhaps with the advent of self-governance, with initiatives towards free education, and so on, and there's a perception that formal equality has already been achieved and is sufficient. Invisibility in this context then speaks mainly to the subtle inequities that sometimes go unnoticed in the formal layers of governance and social interaction, but which nevertheless are felt and internalized. On the other hand, countries like in Canada and the US, where Afro-descendants constitute minority groups, but exist within a long, hard-fought struggle toward formal equality in the form of a fairly legalistic civil liberties regime, we appear to have arrived at somewhat of a pressure point or crossroads. There are certain notions emerging that we have done enough, that we should do no more, and those two ideas are not quite identical, and that perhaps explains best the fear that at the current time there's a risk that civil liberties can be eroded under a facade of formal equality. That is, that we are all equal in the eyes of the law, while society remains effectively deeply inequitable. And the reluctance of formal institutions, including courts, to see these inequities in ways that can be addressed under governance structures is, I think, a form of invisibility. And at yet another point of the spectrum, we have countries such as in Latin America, where our guest speaker will be concentrating on today, where there are minority groups that have not perhaps fully engaged in the kind of historical struggles that we saw in North America, and perhaps a kind of apathy. And the issue here of race equality was forgotten and unseen in the most obvious of ways until recently. And I'm sort of paraphrasing another lecture I went to recently by another distinguished person who spoke on Latin America. So how do we measure equality? What is the quality of the equality of which we speak? Is formal equality sufficient? De jure equality as opposed to de facto. Clearly, strides have been made. We live in every country in the region. We have laws that prohibit racial discrimination. We now have a U.S. president who's an African American. Just recently, this rapporteurship issued a press release celebrating the appointment of an Afro-descendant as Brazil's premier Supreme Court judge. Yes, these are indeed successes. But I think the mere fact that such items are newsworthy is evidence that they are sadly not the norm. And actual equality is still a difficult goal. And I think the cracks are beginning to show in what might seem to be a near-perfect facade. Indeed, this inaugural lecture comes at a very significant point when several issues pertinent to the issue of race inequities are converging. This has been a very intriguing couple of weeks. This week we witnessed the start of the controversial Trayvon Martin trial, which brings the troublesome issue of racial profiling, a subject that deeply concerns the Commission and is in fact discussed in our report, to the very forefront of the U.S. public and indeed much of the world in a way that it can no longer be ignored or blindsided. This week also, in fact yesterday, it could have been the day before because I was traveling, we had a ruling, maybe I'd call it a non-ruling, of the U.S. Supreme Court on affirmative action, asserting the principle of strict scrutiny to be applied. Whatever the verdict, the subject of affirmative action crystallizes the existence of race inequities in a society, despite the disagreements as to how to treat with it. Significant for me was the fact that the Supreme Court did not fully address the issue substantively, referring it back to the lower courts, an act that itself may be viewed as willful blindness. And some of the dicta suggest that merely having legalistic norms of equality is adequate, thus reversing a previously entrenched philosophical notion of what constitutes real equality and justice. That is, the need to treat differently constituted groups differently in order to achieve equal status. Curiously, too, this week, we also witnessed the debacle of Chef Paula Deen. I will say no more about that. And we learned, too, that an Ohio school banned afros and braids. I found that on Facebook. For me, these news items are intriguing, not only because of their content, but because they present a rare window and insight into the issue in a country where it has been difficult to hold the conversation of race in any sustained way. On a more positive note, this month, as we already heard, the OAS passed finally the conventions. And I also want to acknowledge and with gratitude the presence of the ambassador from Antigua. They were so instrumental, Antigua and Barbuda, under the chair of Joy D. Davis, in bringing this to fruition. And of course, our distinguished ambassador, Lovell. What is indisputable and unfortunate is that whatever the country, be it north or south, and whatever the composition and ratio of the ethnic makeup, issues of race still remain and still matter in the 21st century Americas. We discern important, significant similarities in the negative, running through the entire region. Most important, the Commission has concluded that persons of African descent in the Americas still face situations of structural discrimination that affect their civil, political, social, economic, and cultural rights, as well as continuing to be victims of direct discrimination. This is so whether we are speaking of countries where Afro-descendants are minorities or where, as in the countries of the Caribbean, Afro-descendants are in the majority. In the latter, the problem of race is more complex and indeed more subtle, but it exists. And often we have to turn to notions of indirect discrimination in order to explain these persistent, nagging inequities. And so the report did find serious obstacles, access to health, education services, obtaining housing, employment, especially at managerial and upper levels, and underrepresentation of Afro-descendant populations in politics in many countries in the region, which of course exacerbates these difficulties. Alarmingly, in every country in the region, peoples of African descent are on average among the poorest and the most socially disadvantaged. Is this a coincidence? We believe that it is as a result of continuing structural disadvantages originating in historical injustices which continue to mitigate against genuine equality. It is still the case, ladies and gentlemen, that a child of African descent born today will have a lesser chance of succeeding in life than his white counterpart. He or she is more likely to be poor, less likely to receive or be in a position to take advantage of quality education, less likely to have doors opened for him or her, particularly in relation to lucrative enterprises. So while we have less overt racism, there remains fairly strong structural paradigms that exacerbate inequality between the races. Most importantly, financial power is still largely in the hands of white minorities or other ethnic groups increasingly because of business patterns that have shifted little in the centuries. Studies have been done, for example, in the Caribbean, where we like to pat ourselves on the back, demonstrating how black entrepreneurs have greater difficulty securing business loans and capital than white entrepreneurs, thus placing them at a disadvantage from the outset. Similarly, while Afro-descendant majorities do lead or take part in political management, taking account colonial past and slavery, the ownership of economic resources continue to belong to white people, especially white men. And the lucrative tourism industry is one such example. You tend to find Afro-descendants in the lower-ranked jobs. So there's a common denominator in the plight of Afro-descendants, and that is persistent poverty, which itself is a factor in invoking other levels of disadvantage, whether in employment, living conditions, health, access to justice, and protection. Poverty, of course, is often a precursor for one's social class, so that historic conceptions of class stratifications in societies are therefore more likely to endure if the poverty cycles are not changed in meaningful ways. And often we ask, well, why are we talking about invisibility? Isn't it the case that race is no longer relevant? We have equality. It's not about race anymore. It's about class. We hear this very often. These are the kinds of refrains that we hear. Even for this rapporteurship, we continue to attract the least funding out of all of the rapporteurships because there are few willing to engage actively in this issue of race. And why the deafening silence, I would ask? Is it because of a genuine belief that enough progress has been made, or is it willful blindness? My favorite question. So we view the problem of invisibility as a significant obstacle to achieving progress toward actual equality, meaningful equality. So these are not mere coincidences. There's a need to interrogate these issues seriously and objectively with a view to constructing newer paradigms based on genuine equality and social advancement for all of our peoples. Deconstructing invisibility in all its facets is an important step in this process. And as the rapporteur, I remain committed to this goal and also the broader objective of highlighting and addressing the substantive concerns posed by persistent inequities of race. And some of these broader substantive concerns are, for example, the particular problems faced by Afro-descendants in the justice system. Our work plan is very much about access to justice. We see this as an important issue, including obstacles faced by Afro-descendants in accessing and obtaining justice, and also the issues of racial profiling and racial biases in the criminal justice system. And that, of course, is also connected to the persistent poverty of which I spoke before, and also stereotypes and other social dynamics. We also, in the rapporteurship, are inquiring into issues such as the armed conflict and disproportionate, which has a disproportionate impact on Afro-descendants in the region, and other forms of violence, systemic violence in the region, which exacerbates these very complex paradigms of race, where we've had large mining projects, for example. These have led to displacement, violations of economic rights, and even violations of the right to life. And of course, they fuel and exacerbate already present forms of discrimination and vulnerability. We have found too that Afro-descendant women suffer another level of vulnerability and adversity in this regard. We've actually also had press releases about human rights leaders in these sorts of conflicts who have been killed, Afro-descendant leaders. We've had a few press releases on this as well. Given these situations of persistent poverty and disenfranchisement, economic, social, and cultural rights are a particular concern to me because of my other hat as head of our new unit on economic, social, and cultural rights. And we hope to have a special consultation on this in relation to Afro-descendants later this year. We are also in collaboration with the Vance Center researching the issue of voting rights as relates to Afrodescendants that we see as an important aspect of our understanding of access to justice, and the issue of HIV, which again has had a very disproportionate impact on Afrodescendants. Here at the Commission, too, the issue of invisibility permeates our work in the sense that on average, there are fewer matters based on the issue of race than others. Is it that there are less instances of race discrimination or violations of rights happening in the region? Less, for example, than gender or indigenous peoples? I think not. But it is true that fewer are reported or pursued. Why is this? It's all part of the invisibility. Race discrimination is perhaps the most underreported form of discrimination, but at the same time, I think perhaps it's the most complained about in informal ways. And this is exacerbated by the fact that some issues that are or can easily be race complaints are presented sometimes on other grounds. And two good examples. One is the issue of the Garifuna peoples, who perceive themselves as Afro-descendant, but when they come before the Commission, issues are in relation to indigenous peoples, perhaps because the system itself acknowledges that redress is easier when we frame it in that way. Another one is the issue of persons of Haitian descent who are migrants, a very important issue to my rapporteurship ambassador, who in Dominican Republic and other places become stateless. We look at it through the lens of migration, but we have not been looking at it through the lens of race. And I think also when we talk about becoming visible, these are issues that we have to look at. So as rapporteur, part of my mission is to enhance the jurisprudence of the Commission with regard to race issues. And already we have begun to examine these matters relating to sentencing in North America, racial profiling, and so on. Of course, Latin America needs special attention. I had the opportunity last year as rapporteur to learn firsthand about some of the huge disparities between Afro-descendant populations and others. For example, in Colombia on our country visit, and I was able to express my concern face-to-face to the Honorable President. Also in Guatemala, speaking to the Garifuna peoples. And I think it is fitting that our first lecture in this series should be focused on Latin America, but by someone who has a truly global vision. And I, too, Ambassador, had the privilege of speaking to her before, and I couldn't tear away. Global vision of the issue of peoples in the diaspora. None other than our distinguished Dr. Sheila S. Walker, whom it is also my pleasure to introduce you to, who will speak on the topic, Afro-Latins, Histories, Cultures, Identities. She's a cultural anthropologist, she's a filmmaker, executive director of the Afro Diaspora Incorporated, a non-profit organization that is developing documentary films and educational materials about the global African diaspora. She has done field work, lectured, consulted, and participated in cultural events in much of Africa and the African diaspora. She's not an armchair academic by any means, and has numerous scholarly and popular publications. Her most recent works, the documentary Slave Roots, A Global Vision, produced for UNESCO, Slave Root Project, and an edited book, Conocimiento desde adentro, los afro-sudamericanos hablan de sus pueblos y sus historias. Afro-South Americans speak of their people and their histories, featuring articles by Afro-descendants from all of the Spanish-speaking countries of South America. She's also edited African Roots, American Cultures, African the Creation of the Americas, and produced the film Scattered Africa, Faces and Voices of the African Diaspora, based on an international conference she organized with UNESCO support. Dr. Walker was director of the Center for African and African American Studies, the Annabelle Arian Wosham Centennial Professor in the College of Liberal Arts, and Professor of Anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. One of the things I was saying to her before is that at times like this, I regret being a lawyer because anthropologists have such much more interesting lives. And she was the William and Camille Cosby Professor in the humanities and social sciences, professor of anthropology and director of the African Diaspora and the World Program at Spelman College. A very distinguished, learned, and rooted scholar, I present to you Dr. Sheila S. Walker.
Well, I'm very happy to be here today, and I have to say that I'm a little worried about being complicit with the invisibilization of Afro-Latin Americans. I'm from New Jersey, and I suggested to my friend Hilaire Sobers that he invite the people in this book I finished editing recently with a group of Afro-South Americans, but he said it was cheaper for me to come from Southwest than for them to come from Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, so it's really economics. I just received something that I'm ecstatic to see, a book called this book, Conocimiento desde adentro, los afro-suramericanos hablan de sus pueblos y sus historias, knowledge from the inside. Afro-South Americans speak of their people and their histories. And I'm ecstatic to see it, one, because it exists, and that was not an easy task. And it's full of people who are invisibilized. I had a conference on the African diaspora in the modern world in the mid-90s, to which I invited people who didn't exist. And although they didn't exist according to Encyclopedia Britannica, they came anyway, they spoke for themselves, we filmed them, and they seem to exist. But if you check out Encyclopedia Britannica today, it will tell you that Lucia Molina, who came, whom we filmed, who is in this book too, she doesn't exist, from Argentina. Marta Salgado Enriquez from Chile, who is in this book talking about Afro-Chilean, she doesn't exist. Lázaro Medina from Paraguay, who wrote about Afro-Paraguayans, he doesn't exist. And my favorite person who doesn't exist is Juan Angola Maconde from Bolivia, who, when I met him, said, I'm Juan Angola Maconde from Bolivia, and we have no African culture. And I looked at this man who looked quite African, and I said, Angola Maconde? You invented the name. And he said, no, there are lots of Angolas. And he said this seriously. There are lots of Angolas, lots of Macondes, but we have no African culture. Well, I didn't understand exactly how they could manage that. Although these folks should really be here representing themselves, I have to do it because I came from closer. And I realized that my identity, I'm from New Jersey, and I was formally taught in one of the best anthropology departments in the country, University of Chicago. I was formally taught that we U.S. African Americans had no culture. One of our senators, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, wrote that. I have the quote. The impartial Swede who was asked by the Carnegie Commission to study the Negro problem, he also informed us officially that we have no culture. I was bothered by that, studying anthropology and having learned that the definition of human beings as compared to our hairier ancestors was that we have culture, except for us. So I was always bothered by that. And when I began to meet Afro-descendants in Latin America, they also had no culture. So I recognized the issue, and I began to understand that my identity now, as a result of my various researches in various places in Africa, and most recently with Afro-Turks in Izmir. I was there about 2 weeks ago, right after the tear gas started in Taksim Square. That my self-identity is that I'm from the African diaspora with a U.S. passport as an accident of a slave ship. It's not a complaint, but it is an observation. Logically, I should be Brazilian. Almost everybody who came to the Americas from Africa is Brazilian. It is illogical, statistically, to be North American. As many Africans wound up in British North America as wound up in Martinique. So you have a sense of the different geographies. When I hear the statistic that African descendants are a third of the population of the Americas, about 200 million people, I wonder, well, what happened? When, until 1820, African descendants were much more than a third of the population of the Americas. There's a demographic fact that when I learned that, I was shocked that I had never just happened upon it. And the demographic fact is that of the 6.5 million people who crossed the Atlantic Ocean from Africa and Europe to the Americas, 5.5 million came from Africa. 1 million came from Europe. So how can you even think about talking about the Americas and leave out the majority of the people who constituted the basis of all of the societies of the Americas? And there's no society that does not have an African descendant population and culture of African origin. And culture is not necessarily attached to phenotype. There are places that do not have very many African descendants, but where elements of clearly African culture are flagrant. My favorite one is Argentina, that very European country in the Americas, that at the beginning of the 1800s in Buenos Aires had an almost 40% African descendant population. Now, I didn't suspect that, since, of course, I didn't learn that, until I was in Argentina and I went to have dinner and we ate mondongo. I thought, mondongo, that doesn't sound very Spanish. But the people I was with said, oh, yes, it's pure Castilian mondongo. Well, it isn't. It's from Angola, that word. And my other favorite fact about Argentina, this country that is so European, is that if you know nothing about Argentina, you know that their emblematic cultural feature is tango. Well, that's not pure Castilian either. That's a Kimbundu word from Angola that means to dance, to party, to wind your waist. So beginning to learn these things, I thought, we have a lot to demystify about the Americas. And I kind of lost my mind when I was at Spelman College. It became I learned that the United Negro College Fund had money for historically black colleges and universities to create projects with Afro-Latins. Well, money, who doesn't want that? So my first premise was that I couldn't write a proposal about them. I'm from New Jersey. I could write a proposal with them. So I invited a colleague from Venezuela. We wrote a proposal, and we gathered together people from all of the Spanish-speaking countries in South America. We decided that to include Central America would be much too complex. We were initially going to include Brazil, but how can you talk about Brazil and Bolivia? There are not enough Afro-descendants in Bolivia for a good favela in Rio. So we decided, okay, let's circumscribe this and make it make some sense. So we gathered these people together to talk about their societies from the inside. The goal was to create curriculum materials, but you have to have some data to create curriculum materials. Now, how are you going to create curriculum materials about people who don't exist and who are not in the national vision? So, first of all, we had to create a worldview. And the worldview was that we're not talking about what they did to us, we're talking about what we did. So we are talking about protagonism, not about victimization. The whole stereotype of, they're poor, they're oppressed. Okay, that's not untrue, but that's not the whole story. There's so much more to the story. And so we had to help these folks see themselves, however, as protagonists. And we had to help them see themselves as creators of culture. Now, who am I to do this? I'm from New Jersey. But when I went to the University of Chicago, I didn't learn anything about us. We were the people who insisted that we wanted courses, we wanted research centers, we wanted to do the research that denied these experts who said we had no culture, we had no attachments to Africa. So I was just sharing the experiences that I went through with my Southern cousins. And perspective is everything. When Lucia Molina from Argentina came to the meeting with her text actually written, everybody didn't write it, her first sentence was, when some Spaniard arrived at Buenos Aires, he brought 8 slaves. And I said, oh, so you're Spanish? No. So, well, who's the subject of the sentence? We're talking about your subjectivity. So the subject of the sentence is Spanish. This is a problem. And where do you situate yourself? Slaves. Well, we're not having slaves in the book. We're having enslaved people, enslaved human beings. Aimé Césaire from Martinique talked about the chosification, the thingification of African descendants as slaves. Well, I'm not participating in the thingification of my ancestors. So we abolished that concept of slaves as opposed to enslaved people. And it was a fascinating process, working with these folks to see themselves from the inside, to talk about their societies from the inside. Our theme became generating knowledge from the inside. And I think we were quite successful. Everyone in our group from all of the Spanish-speaking countries began to change his or her way of looking at him or herself. And rather than accepting the party line, the national story, that they had no history, they began to go to the archives and find out that they were there in the archives. Jesus Garcia from Venezuela said that in the story he learned, there were no Maroons, nobody resisted in the history of Venezuela. And he went to the same archives to which the national historians had gone, and indeed, he found Maroons. He found people with names, like Miguel Luango, for example, who had been Maroons, who had protested, who had the intention of setting up their own societies. So there's a whole other story that without knowing this whole other story, this invisibilized story, you don't know the story of the Americas. In the past 10 years, I have learned an amazing amount once I understood who was the majority of the people in the Americas for the majority of the history of the Americas. And when you think about it, for the first 300 years of the Americas, the majority of the people were Africans and African descendants. Well, that leaves a trace. What happened to them? Why are African descendants no longer 3/4 of the population of the Americas? Well, part of it is serving as cannon fodder in wars of various sorts. When I think of the War of the Triple Alliance of Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil against Paraguay, I think that probably looked like a war of Nigeria, Benin, and Togo against Cameroon, if you consider who the people were in the front lines. So that was a really good way to get rid of African descendants. Then there was the deliberate political policy of whitening in Argentina. Now, I don't want to just pick on Argentina, but the generation of the 80s, led by Sarmiento, major educational leader, the specific policy was to whiten the country by inviting Europeans to come and bring their genes. Because Argentina, Uruguay, they wanted to be modern American nations like the United States. But they weren't white enough, so they brought all these white folks to whiten the population. That was a deliberate policy. That's why the Pope, the first Latin American Pope, has an Italian name. Well, he's part of that whitening process in Argentina. But if we don't know this, we don't really know the story of the Americas. The economy of the Americas. What was Africans all over the place, and African descendants are characterized as lazy. Lazy? Well, all they did was come to work. Africans were not brought to the Americas to do anything other than work. And that's what they did. They sol a sol, from kin to quaint. We have expressions for that in various of the languages of the Americas. Between 1650 and 1850, who produced 75% of all of the goods produced in the Americas to fuel the economy of the Atlantic world? Enslaved Africans. But one of the things that we don't tend to be taught is that these enslaved Africans did not just bring bodies. They were recruited. Many of them were recruited specifically not for the fact that they didn't know anything. How much sense does that make? You want to build new societies in the Americas. And these Europeans who came to the Americas were not tropical people. Most of the Americas to which Africans were brought, most of the Americas are most of the areas are tropical areas. People have to eat. Who knew tropical agriculture? Europeans? No. And they weren't the ones who were going to work anyway. Africans were brought because they knew the nature. They were also brought because they knew the technologies of the era. On the level of food, rice culture in the Americas is African. Rice culture in the United States, what's called Carolina rice, should be called Senegambian rice or Sierra Leonean rice, because that rice was domesticated not in Asia, it was domesticated in Africa. It's a different scientific category of rice from Asian rice. Gold. The Europeans didn't come to the Americas just to hang out. They were looking for gold, El Dorado. And who were the gold miners in the Americas? Once the Spanish and Portuguese found the gold of the indigenous people, who's going to get the gold out of the earth? Well, the Portuguese had been going to the area that they called the Costa da Mina, that the British call Gold Coast, that is now Ghana. They'd been going there since the mid-1400s. They knew who knew how to mine gold and who knew how to work gold into objects of value. So when in Minas Gerais in Brazil they had a gold rush, who did they bring to get the gold out of the mines, to work the gold? People they called Negros Minas, from the place it's now called Elmina Castle in Ghana. In Minas Gerais, it was said that having Mina Africans in mines brought, and I love this expression, an almost magical luck. Luck? Luck? Or technological expertise. And I think it's really important for us to understand that the transatlantic commerce in enslaved Africans was not at all random. Europeans knew which Africans produced what, which Africans knew which technologies. I mean, this was a serious system that lasted for hundreds of years, was perfected over the hundreds of years that it lasted, and has left clear traces in the Americas. One of the things that I'm very interested in at the moment is looking at an alternate map of the Americas. We all know the European colonial map. That's the one we live with. We think that, I think we tend to think that that is the map of the Americas. It is a map of the Americas. It's the map that divides us into the different European colonial languages that we speak. But I'm very conscious now, as a result of my research, that there's a whole there are indigenous maps of the Americas. Obviously, they were here before the European colonial map imposed itself. But there are also African maps of the Americas, and these maps are partially determined by which technological expertises were brought by which Africans. When rice was brought to the United States, for example, and to Brazil and to Mexico, where was the rice brought from? The Senegambia, Sierra Leone. Those were the rice planters. And so when ships' captains were going to that part of Africa, they were asked by planters to bring rice Negroes. There are those posters from the time of slavery, rice Negroes. The person who wrote a really seminal book about this transfer of technology from Africa to the Americas, Judith Carney, wrote a book called Black Rice. Her inspiration, she was driving down a street in Mexico, a road south of Veracruz, and she saw the sign that said Mandingo. And she had worked in the Senegambia with the Mandinga people who were rice producers. And she saw this word, what is this doing in Mexico? So she goes to Mandinga in Mexico, near Veracruz, about a half hour away. And what does she find? It had been a rice plantation. So it kept its name that continues to indicate what its historical role was. If you go to the Pacific coast of Ecuador and Colombia, you find a lot of people named Mina. And those people named Mina are concentrated in areas where there are or were gold mines. I went to a village called Playa de Oro, Gold Beach, in northern Esmeraldas in Ecuador. And there are a whole lot of people there named Mina, and a lady showed us how she continues to use the placer mining technique to find gold in Playa de Oro, where a lot of people are called Mina, who came from the Gold Coast. So I'm just fascinated by all of the visibilization that needs to happen. I've also been doing some research in Panama. Panama is a total African map, and it's written into the toponymy. There are places called, there are 4 rivers that are named Congo. 4 Rios Congos. 4. Seems like a lot. There's a Kwango, and it's right by a village named Kwango, right by the Kwango River. Well, Kwango, and the Kwango River was the eastern margin of the Congo Kingdom. I went to a small island in the Pacific where there's Cerro Congo right next to Cerro Carabali. So Congo Hill is right next to Carabali Hill. Calabar, Nigeria, a place of departure of Africans from the Igbo area, Ibibio area, and southeastern Nigeria. We went around the island, and we went to a village in the interior called La Guinea, Guinea. And to get to Guinea, you go up a tidal river that's called Palenque. A Palenque was a Maroon community. Now, unfortunately, if you ask the people in La Guinea what the story is of the village, they say it refers to bananas, because Guineo is a banana. And they don't know their story. They don't understand that their story is part of the creation of the Americas. They don't understand that their story is part of people who probably fled from enslavement, created a maroon society at the entrance to this tidal river that leads to a village that became called Guinea. So I suggest that, and I think this is a wonderful place to think about doing this here at the OAS, that in thinking about the issue of visibilization, we think a little more about looking at something other, at indicators other than this European map of the Americas. And what we find in doing so is a map that, rather than separating us according to European criteria, unites us according to African criteria, and it unites us in surprising ways. For example, there are countries in which the marimba is an emblematic instrument, like Ecuador, part of the Pacific coast of Colombia, Mexico, Guatemala, Nigeria. Except that, Nicaragua. But in the Central African countries, the marimba is said to be an indigenous instrument. Its Africanity isn't even thought about. It's a national instrument of Guatemala, and it has become a very European-sounding instrument. What I want to know is, if it is an indigenous instrument, why doesn't it have any place in the Americas an indigenous name? No place does it have an indigenous name. Every place it exists in the Americas, it's called marimba, a Kimbunda word from Angola. So we have some inconsistencies. And these inconsistencies are based on this invisibilization of Africa as an origin of cultural phenomena in the Americas. In Panama, for example, they have Congo kings and queens, just like they have in Brazil, just like there are vestiges in various places in the Caribbean of Congo kings and queens. I believe in Trinidad there's the Congo Queens dance. But I'm doing research right now in Panama on these Congos, and there are queens and kings. The queen is more important than the king. They have a Congo period it begins in January, it ends at Ash Wednesday, but they say this is not a carnival phenomenon. The carnival comes inside what is called the carnival period. During the carnival period, they speak what they call the Congo language, that if you don't understand it, you don't understand it. It's not an African language. It is a deformed Spanish, but it is sufficiently sufficiently appropriated by these Congos that if they want you to understand, they can help you understand. If they don't want you to, you don't understand anything. What is the interpretation that's given by Panamanians for this phenomenon? That it's a parody of Spanish royalty. Now, I want to know when any enslaved Africans in Panama ever had visits from the Spanish royalty. I suspect that didn't happen. The problem is Africa is excluded as a possible interpretation. And that's kind of shocking for a phenomenon called Congo, in which the participants look like they might have come from Congo. No one I've ever encountered in Panama has said this could be the continuation of the Kingdom of the Congo, the most important kingdom in Central Africa, from which many people wound up in Panama. So we had these strange interpretations of things that have very little to do with reality as a result of not considering Africa as a basis for interpretation of the phenomena of the Americas. And I think that access to education, to equal education, is very important. But what kind of education? If you're going to be learning things that disempower you, that further alienate you, as opposed to helping you understand your protagonism. If you understand your protagonism, maybe you have some sense of what you deserve. I think we have... this miseducation. Carter G. Woodson in 1934 published a book called The Miseducation of the Negro. Until we resolve the issue of continued systematic miseducation, it's not going to be easy to resolve the issue of the injustices of which African descendants are victims. We have some historical myths, okay, that also need clarifying. I learned so much in working with these Spanish-speaking Afro-South Americans and doing this book. And one of the themes that a colleague who helped me correct the texts said I had to look at was the role of the black and brown militias, particularly in the Bolivarian Revolution. And I said, militias, that's guy stuff. I'm really not interested in that. So I tried not to pay any attention to it, but he insisted that I had to look at the role of the black and brown militias, the milicias de negros y pardos, in the liberation of Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, by Simón Bolívar. So the first thing, I had to eventually, comply, although I wasn't interested in that guy stuff. First thing I learned was that Bolívar wasn't doing very well in his battle for the independence of those countries. And then I learned that both the independentists and the loyalists understood that they needed troops from the African descendant enslaved population if they were going to win. Both sides didn't agree on much, but that's one of the things they agreed on. And then I learned that since he wasn't doing so well, Bolívar went to the second independent country in the Americas, the first country in the Americas to abolish slavery and declare all of its citizens, Haiti. And this happened how many decades before the United States declared all of its citizens? About 60 years, I think. Haiti, 1804, United States, 1865. So Bolívar asked President Pétion for assistance, strategy, money, troops, boats, and he promised in return to free the enslaved people in the lands that he would liberate. That didn't happen any place. And those people were re-enslaved to the extent that they didn't revolt against being re-enslaved. And what I found the most shocking, and that was because I didn't entirely know the history of the United States, was that when the African descendants were eventually emancipated 2 generations after the promise, after they had helped emancipate their enslavers, the first article, for example, in the Colombian Emancipation Law was about how much the former enslavers would be recompensed for the loss of their human property. So the people who had worked for hundreds of years to enrich their enslavers were not recompensed with anything, and those same enslavers who had been enriched during hundreds of years were given a bonus for freeing their human property. And only last year did I understand that in Washington, D.C., that was called compensated emancipation. Washington, D.C. compensated the former enslavers for freeing their human property. So that didn't get generalized in the United States. When the South lost, those planters did not get recompensed. So I think we have a lot to de-invisibilize about Afro-Latins, about the culture of people of African origin in the Americas, all of us. And for that reason, I don't feel like I'm preempting the privilege of these folks in Conocimiento desde Adentro in speaking for them, since apparently there wasn't money in the budget for them all to be here. And I think that if we're going to tell an honest story of the Americas, we need to consider telling the story of the people who were the majority of the population during the majority of the history of the Americas. We need to understand the role of Africans and African descendants in creating national identities in the Americas. When I was learning that I had no culture, that U.S. African Americans had no culture, the United States, the same country where I was learning this, was doing what was called cultural diplomacy. And they were sending around the world representatives of what President Dwight Eisenhower called the high culture of the United States. And who were they? Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, the creators of the only classical music of the Americas, jazz. So, there's been an enormous amount of hypocrisy that has kept invisibilized the story of African descendants throughout the Americas. And I hope that I understand that the OAS isn't such a cultural organization, but it is, that it is very important to have access to justice, but it's also important to have access to cultural justice, educational justice, the equal rights to understand who you are, to know your story, to know what you contributed, so as to know what you deserve. And it's been very gratifying to work with my Southern cousins in this process, who, in learning more about themselves and in learning more about their story, desde adentro, from the inside, and who've learned more about telling their own story, they've been using what they've learned as a basis to insist upon more rights. When the Afro-Ecuadorians went to the State House to say, we want to be in the Constitution, we want a day recognizing us, they took their marimbas. When the Afro-Bolivians went to the State House for the Constituent Assembly and got themselves into the Constitution, although there are not many of them, they're in the Constitution, they took their saya drums and dances. And so they used their culture and their increased knowledge of their story to insist upon justice and to insist upon being visible in the nation and globally. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You see why I said an anthropologist is a lot more interesting than a lawyer. Before I open the floor, I just wanted to just say I couldn't speak to everything, but our report and the approach of the OAS does also acknowledge and see visibility as acknowledging the contributions of Afro-descendants to their societies and so on. That is, in fact, part of the report and part of the thrust of the OAS. In fact, even when we talk about economic, social, cultural rights, very important. So I thought I would mention that as I'm opening the floor and give you the opportunity to talk about some of the revolutionary ideas that were thrown out. Yes, Ambassador, you're hot off you're ready to go. Do you need a mic? Yes, I think perhaps you need a mic, yes.
Good afternoon. I am Deborah May Lovell, and I am the ambassador of Antigua and Barbuda, and I don't even know where to begin. You have given so much food for thought. But first, let me thank the rapporteurship for having this session this afternoon. It is part of creating the visibility of this aspect, as we have spoken about in this session. I want to say that my delegation, Antigua and Barbuda, we see it as our mission to carry this story forward. It was in the last century, last decade of the last century, that Antigua and Barbuda took the bold step to introduce race into the conversation of the OAS. It was not met with civility, but we were determined to tell the story, and we would not shut up. And with that, we issue the pledge that we will continue to ensure that the story of Afro-descendants is told and told throughout the hemisphere. So thank you very much for recognizing the fact that Antigua and Barbuda piloted the conventions of racism and all forms of discrimination. Several points I wish to raise. I very much appreciate your telling the story of telling our own story, because very often we position ourselves along the spectrum of someone else's story. And to give an example, in Antigua and Barbuda, we never say that we were discovered by Christopher Columbus. We say he was our first tourist. We tell the story of those who existed before Columbus. I very much enjoyed your speaking about the contributions that go unheralded. I give another example of this. We do not fully appreciate the contributions made by the enslaved persons to the development of the metropolis. Prime Minister Eric Williams writes about this in his seminal work. And incidentally, I understand that when he was at Oxford, they refused to honor his studies, and he had to go to Howard University for his thesis to be fully recognized, and his book on capitalism and slavery, how Europe, capitalism and slavery. There is another area I'd wish to bring to our attention, and this is the question of a very important institution in the United States and how it had its origin. In 1807, when the slave trade was abolished, there was a plantation owner in Antigua and Barbuda who thought it was no longer profitable for him to have a plantation in Antigua, since he could no longer get free labor. And so he sold the plantation in my country, and he took 60 enslaved persons up to the United States, and from the proceeds that he obtained from selling his property in Antigua and Barbuda, he established Harvard Law School. This gives an indication as to how the stories of the invisible peoples is not told. And these seminars, these fora, give an opportunity, but there is so much more to be said. And I would like to commend the organizers for this seminar, for this forum this afternoon, because we are just scratching the surface. There is so much to be said about the invisible. I wish now to go on to another area of the invisible, and that is the question of the perception of the black woman and how we define beauty, and how beauty is defined, and how we are perceived. Because there is the phenomenon of the bleaching process whereby we try to make ourselves less black by bleaching our skins. We see the issuance, or we see the code word called ethnic. That is when some of our brothers determine that they want wives, they say they want ethnic women. That is as far removed from the Mandingo perception. And we see that in the athletes, and we see that as well in the, we see this being said by the actors as well in Hollywood. I'm just raising these points because these are invisible aspects of our culture which often are not spoken about. And I wanted to raise these points this afternoon because it is an opportunity for us to talk about the invisible aspect of racism which we ourselves perpetuate. So there's so much more to talk about, but I will close by saying as well, thank you for your expose, and to thank the organizers of this afternoon's forum. Thank you so very much.
Ambassador from Haiti. I'm just for the record because we are being webcast. So distinguished.
Thank you so very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ambassador Bakshi Edman. I'm the Deputy Ambassador to the OAS. I'm very glad to be here this afternoon, and thank you so very much for your very excellent presentation. Before I begin, before I ask my question, I just wish to once again congratulate the mission of Antigua and Barbuda for all those efforts they have made, particularly Jody, with regards to the working group on the convention that has been ratified by General Assembly. And sometimes one of the issues that was really struck me and this along this process is the lack of participation, even in the Caribbean mission. That's what really struck me. I couldn't understand that. Every time when we used to have those negotiations, Jordi particularly had to call every single mission to make sure that they will be there. And on issue that should have been the first priority. And that sometimes I'm wondering if even we as African descent, if we do not contribute on our own, I don't know what exact word I should be using, but I prefer not to. Once again, thank you so very much for coming over. And with regard to the convention, probably Antigua and Barbuda will take a lead. Many people will be talking about, God forbid, about Nelson Mandela very soon because for his situation now. I believe, and the memo, if in case, what will happen? It seems to be going to the worst. But if in case that could happen, I believe those nations within the Americas, they need to sign and ratify those conventions in his memory. Yes. That should have been the best thing to do. Therefore, Antigua and Barbuda probably may take the lead through your Prime Minister, even probably next week at the head meeting, trying to talk to those head of states and head of governments and probably make the mission within the Americas to have those conventions signed and ratified by all. Whenever I'm participating in this kind of lectures or on the African descent histories and African history or black histories, sometimes I get to be very jealous. But at the end of the day, I started to be very jealous. But at the end of the day, you finally mentioned my country because that's seriously. I never want to imagine whenever someone is talking about black history or African history, not to mention Haiti, because Haiti is the first black nation. United States probably was the first country, independent country in the Western Hemisphere. But the U.S. always, finally, in 2008 or 2009, they finally recognized that we Haitians, we participated alongside them in the battle against the British. They erected a monument in Savannah, Georgia, in the memory of the Haitian slaves who came to fight alongside them. But it took a long time to acknowledge that. And so many invisible things with regards to Haiti, even though the today's situation, most of black people, probably they don't want anything to be related to Haiti, because Haiti probably is not the United States. But they tend always to forget that Haiti was the first country who fought for that, who abolished the slavery, and then particularly for the region, the South American region, to participate with, as you mentioned, with Simon Bolivar and giving them troops, money, and weapons. That is the story of Haiti. We contributed to free the southern region of the Americas. And sometimes, but fortunately, history cannot be deleted. History will always have a way to be told. Sometimes they don't want to say that, but I'm glad you mentioned that, and I'm glad that you have this research party. This book is very important for them for most of people, academics or students to read. And I thank the organizer, but I would love to see this kind of a lecture to be given probably within the Permanent Council event or the whole of America, and to be even a bigger event. So I strongly recommend that. So this lecture to be given somewhere else within the OS, not only at this little forum, but even bigger forum, just to expand, to teach people. Because sometimes you might have a PhD, but you tend to ignore history, but you need to be taught. Those things are very important. Thank you.
Thank you, yes. And Haiti, also in Venezuela, their role in Venezuela. So, yes, we have another question at the back. Would you like to state your...
Good afternoon. My name is Gilberto Amaya, and I'm a member of the Plataforma Cumbre Mundial de Afrodescendientes, which came from the celebration of the first summit of Afrodescendants in 2011. First of all, I would like to express my appreciation for this opportunity from the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights to have this kind of discussion. I wish there were more people here in attendance, but I'm sure somebody else is watching from around the region. I would like to join the ambassador in congratulating the mission of Antigua and Barbuda and the ambassador Lowell here for their leadership in this process, because it's been a long and difficult process, as we know. And it also offers a big challenge to the organization, because we all know, and we've been watching how the organization represents, or absorbs Afro-descendants from Latin America to participate, as employees and staff and consultants in this organization. So there's a big challenge there that needs to be addressed. And as we move on, we'll continue to work with the OAS to see that this challenge is met. We need more people that look like us inside the organization. There's a good representation from the Caribbean countries, but from Latin America is kind of short. Also, on Dr. Walker's presentation, that was great. I always learn a lot when I come to your conferences. And when you talk about the contribution of Africans to the building of these nations, there's two sides of the equation. And as we interact more and more with the African diaspora here and also with African countries, we see that there's been very little discussion on what Africa lost, in this process. Because as you well said, there was all these people who were knowledgeable, of technologies that were brought across the Atlantic, but that left a vacuum back home, and the development of those countries, was slowed down by this process of extraction of knowledge and people. So increasingly, this is a discussion that needs to take place, because some kind of a compensation or eventually, may take place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It is always difficult to follow my good friend when he speaks. He goes to the heart of the matter. Professor, congratulations and thank you for this very wonderful lecture. Number one, is the book available? And is it in English? Okay. He told me to identify myself. I'm Hubert Charles. I'm the ambassador for Dominica. So that's one, I think, a very easy solution in terms of diffusing the information that you have brought, is to ensure that the book is available. Probably a copy should go to the Columbus Library, and we should try our best to see how we can translate this. The second issue that I wanted to raise was hinted at, I think, by the last speaker, and that is, what do we do about this problem? I think you have started, because there's an anthropological solution, that is to do the research so that people understand what is happening. But I also think that there's a diplomatic solution, and it pertains to us. Antigua has already started in terms of the norms that we should establish within the organization. But there's also a diplomatic posture that I think that is possible. In other words, and the obligation for assuming that posture is important for the independent countries of the Caribbean, including of course Haiti. I think all of us have an obligation to work with our fellow members of the organization to make it easier for the rather difficult decisions that need to be taken with regard to increasing the visibility of Afro-descendants, that takes place. And to me, I think we can be partners. So I am asking, what do we do from a studies point of view? I always worry about the OS and its Department of Culture, which seem to be active but not active enough, and certainly not in areas like this. Because for me, one of the fundamental goals of the organization is to reveal so much of what is hidden. So the question is, how do we go about it? How do we go about it? How do we partner with our Brazilian or Colombian friends and to raise these issues that are uncomfortable, okay, but to do it in such a way that they see partnership rather than see embarrassment? How exactly do we do this? For me, this is the challenge of the future, and this is for me a diplomatic imperative, because you talk about diplomacy and culture. We have to use the diplomatic opportunities that we have to air what has been hidden for so long, some of those vital cultural and nationalistic issues. But ultimately, they are human rights issues, okay? Because we're talking about being faithful to the promise that we have made, that all the people of the hemisphere will be given their due. All of them can feel partners and members of this hemispheric movement. So we really need to understand exactly how we go about it. So again, thank you very much. I really like this. I like the idea also that a similar lecture should be given to the Permanent Council, because it is there that I think the variety of representatives should be reintroduced. I suspect that most of us have been introduced, but reintroduced to the idea that so much of our people are outside of the pale of the future that we want to design for this hemisphere. Thank you very much. Congratulations again.
Thank you, Ambassador. But I just wanted to mention that I agree with what Deputy Ambassador from Haiti was saying about the need perhaps also for sensitization of our own members in CARICOM, for example, the ambassadors. And I mentioned also our commission needing to be able to make visible race issues. Yes, we're addressing some issues, but not necessarily contextualizing them in terms of race. So I think we also here have some work to do before we can bring it forward. Do we have other questions? There were some very ideas about transplantation of technology. Yes. Please give your name first.
Yes, I had a comment. Dr. Walker, it's a pleasure to actually hear you. I'm accustomed to listening to you with Hugh Hamilton on WBAI, and I'm very pleased that I have had the opportunity to actually hear you speak in person. I am from New York, and I am the daughter of an African immigrant. I raised that because as being from New York City, but I teach in this region a class on race and ethnic relations. And one of the reasons why I came here was because, one, you were going to be talking about Africans, of Afro-Latinos, and which is a topic that's close to my heart, coming from New York. And also I'd have the opportunity to hear you speak. In my classes, I have a challenge. Well, you know some of the intercultural stuff that goes on within our community. I have had my students go, the Anacostia Museum, which is in part of Smithsonian, had a exhibit, The African Presence in Mexico, and also Henry Louis Gates had Africans in Latin America. And one of my students said, wow, I didn't know there were African Americans in all of these places, which, we got a lot of work to do, and I'm going to try to access some of your material in an effort to help me do the work that I'm trying to do. But I'm asking you, what suggestions do you have that we can use to open up the minds of our folks? Because a lot of the immigration issue is not clearly a mestizos Latino issue. There are Africans from the Caribbean, Africans from Africa. There are people that this immigration issue is going to affect. So pretty much, what can we do to open the minds of quote-unquote so-called African Americans?
Thank you. A concrete answer about the book. I am so glad to finally see this thing. I just got this Thursday, and it was published in Bolivia, of all the strange places, because this group I managed to get together that we call the Grupo Barlovento, because we met in the Barlovento region of Venezuela, I managed to get funds, it's always about funds, for us to get together 4 times in Venezuela, Atlanta, Georgia, where I was teaching, Ecuador, and then Bolivia, and it was published in Bolivia. Well, publishing a book about African descendants in Bolivia is like having a funeral. It was impossible to get unless you found out where the office was that published it and went there. And I said, well, what if somebody wants to, can you get it online? No. So there was no way to get it. It existed, but it couldn't be gotten anyplace. It was just republished in Colombia. And so finally, I actually got to see it. And so now it's available. You can get it online. If you Google Conocimiento desde Adentro, it actually takes you to a website where you can buy it en español. So the next issue to make it a little more available is an English translation. And does the Organization of American States have translation money? Assistance in getting it translated? I'd love that.
I heard an offer from the ambassador from Dominica.
Yes. Okay.
That would mobilize.
Yes, okay. Well, I'd be grateful, because it does obviously need to be in English. It's wonderful that it's in Colombia now, the country with the first African descendant population in a Spanish-speaking country. So I'm ecstatic about that. I'm also pleased that Colombia has 2 educational processes. They have the Cátedra de Estudios Afrocolombianos, so the Afro-Colombian Studies program, and a program in ethnoeducation. So it has some probable readers, and it was published by a university press, so I'm ecstatic about all that, but it does have to be translated into English. I always love to talk about this topic. This is what I do. And so I'd love to talk about it in a larger forum. Now, I had really, I had this fantasy that the people who represent the countries that are represented in this book might be here, Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Paraguay, Peru, Uruguay, Venezuela. Are they? Huh? Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh, she's from Argentina.
There was a Lucy Molina who was the Minister of Education.
Oh, okay.
She's an African.
Oh, yes, the trenzas. Yes. Where are you from? Okay. I was just writing about Ecuador today and the Africanity of Ecuador. So I would love to talk about this. I also have a documentary, 3 in reality, that might be interesting to show. One is about the Americas, and it's we have translations in English, translations or subtitles in English, French, and Spanish, and sort of a Portuguese one. It's a half hour. It's called Scattered Africa, Faces and Voices of the African Diaspora. And it's a pretty good version of the America's story. This is it. So I'd be pleased to show this someplace because I'm really committed to telling this story. You know, I know that the folks in this book don't have access to telling the story in a broad forum. So to the extent that, you know, I live in Southwest as opposed to La Paz, I'd be pleased to do this more. I was at the UN for some event, and I was sitting next to the ambassador from Argentina, and there was some event about African descendants, and he said, I didn't ask him this, he said, oh, we don't have black people in Argentina. He volunteered. I didn't ask him that. And then the Bolivian ambassador walked by, and he said, oh, they don't have any either. And I thought, you really don't know your story very well. So I think it would be, I don't know how you could create an educational program so that the folks whose countries are represented in here might get to know a little bit more about their stories, about why they dance tango in Argentina, for example. And with respect to getting U.S. African Americans to understand that we're not the African diaspora, that drives me up a wall. That whole concept that we're the African diaspora and the African diaspora speaks English when we're not the majority, we don't speak the majority language, and that level of ignorance is, you know, it's maintained. But I'm interested in doing more film, popular education, more. I'm working on a book now. I was asked by a major New York publisher to do a popular book on the global African diaspora. So I'm working on that. I don't know who's going to read it, you know, who reads. But, okay. Yeah. So, you know, I do, with respect to the question about, I have another book that's called, in English, African Roots, American Cultures, Africa and the Creation of the Americas. And it doesn't, it includes some of the invisible people. There are 2 Uruguayans, since they don't exist. So there are 2 of them. There Lucia Molina from Argentina is in there. There are Afro-Brazilians in it. So this book was kind of my mea culpa, because when I had this conference, I didn't invite anybody from Bolivia. I didn't know one Angola, Maconde yet. And so I felt that I couldn't keep those people out in the cold, so I had to get some more money and bring them in so that now I'm helping them become visible also. So to the extent that, you know, I can be involved in your processes, I would think that diplomatically, what about trying to create some sort of gathering with the Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, those folks, to talk about this. Last week at the State Department, there was a meeting about Colombia, and there was an event at the Colombian embassy. The Colombian ambassador was there, so he was certainly saying all the right things. I don't know. You're the diplomats. I'm the anthropologist.
Good afternoon. My name is Francisco Lopez. I work with the Birth Colonization Institute, which is an international NGO, formerly with the Obama administration. So, Dr. Sheila, thank you. Very revealing. I think that I've been, you know, these kind of conversations are really always teasing of the minds. But with all the respect that and all the experience and the diplomats we have in the room, I want to throw a question out there. And the question is, so what? I mean, how many conversations have I been to? We've talked about this stuff. I've been talking about this stuff since I was an undergrad. I mean, really. And they're important. And this is not any reflection in your research. So what? And it goes back to the Dominican ambassador. I think I really want to echo what he was trying to suggest in a very diplomatic way. And I'm not a diplomat, so I'm going to say it outright. Until we, as a people, get together and start really mobilizing and using this information to empower ourselves and to build coalitions and to build organizations and to challenge the status quo and to ask for the money that we deserve, so we won't be begging for translation money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not going to change. I mean, we have the right to make these types of requests, and we have the knowledge, the power, the information to people in the room, to navigate this stuff. So I want to end that. So what? Until we really start doing something, we can have 1,000 more of these and talk about all these beautiful things and go, wow.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Allison Moses. I'm President and CEO of Rica Diaspora or Hica Diaspora. I want to thank the OAS, where I usually work in the interpreter's booth, for this occasion, and thank my dear friend Sheila for teaching me once again the history that I didn't know. I would like to respond to the so what question and say this. It is crucial for us, yes, to mobilize, to gather our forces, and to register our history. I want to invite you to what I, Rica Diaspora, has done with a partner in our office in Brazil to take Dr. Julius Garvey, my dear friend, Marcus Garvey's son, to Brazil in August. The jury hasn't quite come in yet. We have put our proposal to the Fundo Baobá, a first black foundation in Brazil, to support us. And we're passing this around to other organizations in Brazil as well. So the so what is that we can, through me, through us, through all of us together, gather our forces, get our resources, and invite Dr. Garvey, Dr. Mandela's daughter, and there are about 5 that at my dining room table we spoke about taking to Brazil. Brazil simply because it has the largest black population outside of Nigeria on this side of the Atlantic. So that's the so what. We can take this and put it in action. Now, let me just conclude by telling you one of the objectives. We have several objectives. One is to familiarize. Well, it all began because Dr. Garvey said to me, Dr. Garvey being a vascular surgeon, "Are you taking me to Brazil?" So, I mean, that's always music to my ears, since that's where I grew up, being of Guyanese father and Jamaican mother. We've put this now on paper. We're going to take Dr. Garvey to Brazil. That's just the first country. Dr. Garvey is heavily vested in the diaspora. He is willing to go to any country, and he does often go and spread the word, talk about unity, education, and Pan-Africanism, National Year of Pan-Africanism, as declared by the organization, the African Union. So I invite you to all get together, and do that. Not just take. I don't really need the microphone. Put together a group of. One of the objectives is for us to not only increase Dr. Garvey's knowledge that he has requested through me, but to also bridge the gap, in this case with Brazil, between the diasporas, increase our knowledge of each other, hopefully come out with a video of this trip, God willing, inshallah, and raise the awareness of the situation in Brazil of Afrodescendants for Americans through Dr. Garvey's voice and my own and all of yours, and do the same thing on the Brazilian side, so that there is something, to the so what. And I love that question because I'm the one that always asks it too. So what? Where do we go from here? Well, that's a practical example of implementing one of the dreams that we have, and that is to raise the awareness on both sides, all sides of the Atlantic, and to speak to the Afro-Bolivianos and Afro-Colombianos, y todos los Afrodescendientes en el mundo. I mean, that's the bottom line. Thank you.
Just to comment as to the so what and what we might do in our individual areas of life. When Antigua and Barbuda was chair of the Permanent Council in 2007, we sought to ensure that the other ambassadors and the other diplomats accredited to the OAS knew our story. And so we arranged for Hilary Beckles from the Cayfield campus to come to the OAS to present to the Permanent Council a talk on the triangular trade and where the position of the Africans in the Americas and how they contributed to building this continent. So I would like to recommend that such an approach be taken perhaps every year so as to ensure that the diplomats that come in every year, since these jobs are very transitory, are very much aware of the history of the hemisphere. It's something that Antigua and Barbuda would certainly like to promote. Thank you.
Your last comment.
One of the things what I've discovered is that we have in the Americas, in these European colonial nations, we've learned about our differences. And in learning and teaching about the African diaspora, I've loved to show my films to U.S. African Americans who say, oh, like Bush, former president, oh, there are black people in Brazil? But what I've observed is people, once they see other people, well, that looks like my aunt. Well, that looks like my cousin. Except how come he's speaking a different language? Now, where is that? Peru? Oh, where is that? People get a sense of being global themselves and get a greater sense of, I see. So we all have similar stories. I can learn about my story from learning about your story. I mean, that was my personal experience. I wanted to know how come people got happy at Hopewell Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey. And when I went to a candomblé ceremony in Bahia, I got it. I understood it from that experience. And I have a film on Bahia. And when people see the candomblé, they say, oh, well, that looks like my aunt's church. And so once you see the similarities, then you can't say, well, I'm just from New Jersey. No, I'm not just from New Jersey. You know, I mean, my sense of where I belong in the world is pretty big. I consider myself a citizen of the African diaspora. So the issue of I'm a minority, what do you mean? Where? No, I'm not buying that. So I did bring some copies of Conocimiento, but I didn't bring them in English yet. They're in Spanish. But that's one of the languages of the African diaspora, right? We can't expect everything to be in English.
Before I hand over to Hilaire, who's going to do the vote of thanks, I just wanted, although I said before that he was the one who worked hard to organize that, let me just add my own thanks to Hilaire for all his hard work for organizing the event. So now you can do.
Thank you, Rosemary. It's great. This today has been a significant event. In fact, the butterflies did not stop fluttering until some minutes past 3. You know, as by usual. But I have to say, I mean, I'm so absolutely excited and appreciative of you, Sheila, for being our inaugural speaker. I have to share a little history. I mean, you know, when we first started, and I have to thank Rosemary, too, for supporting the ambition and the vision of having a lecture series. I mean, it's something that Rosemary has made a priority in terms of the rapporteurship. But when I first, you know, because, I mean, I saw Sheila as this huge star. You know, I mean, here am I, you know, humble me, you know, writing a little letter on behalf of the rapporteur to say, you know, Dr. Walker, will you please... And immediately, I mean, it was like within a day or so, I mean, you know, Sheila Walker was like, yes, I'll do it. No problem. And it's like, wow. And really, because we were originally supposed to have done this lecture from about, I think, April. And for different reasons, it had to be put off. And I think And Professor Walker has been most understanding and most flexible because we've had to work around her schedule, share around our constraints, and really, so it's not just simply the brilliance of the lecture that I'm thanking you for, but also your patience and forbearance along the way. I have to say that Professor Walker is an incredible storyteller. I had the opportunity of having lunch with her, and I thought we were just going to talk logistics. And I was just spellbound for the whole time. I mean, in fact, lunch came and went. I was like, my hand was like this, like, more. To me, a kind of typical African style storytelling. And this is what I think that she brought today. I mean, I just watched faces just riveted, was watching. I mean, it wasn't by no means a kind of standard stand here and just deliver it. It was animated, and personal and engaging, and I really, really appreciate that. Thank you very much, Sheila. Okay, let me go on with the other aspects of the vote of thanks. I'd like to certainly thank Ambassador Ramdin. He had to leave earlier for another appointment. Again, somebody who was unhesitating in agreeing to give his opening remarks, and certainly we appreciate his support for our mission, certainly, which is part of which is the theme of the lecture series, which is transforming the invisible into the visible. I would like to specially recognize Elizabeth Abbey Merched, who is our assistant executive secretary. She is, in a sense, sitting in for our executive secretary, Emilia Alvarez, who is unavoidably away. But certainly I'd like to thank Elizabeth. Elizabeth is my immediate boss and certainly has given me the support that I need. They helped with rounding up the troops today, so thank you, Elizabeth. And certainly, while I'm talking about the staff of the Commission, certainly this could not have happened without the staff of the Commission, and I want to say a special thank you to two staff members, Ilsia and Pat, who organized all the logistics, all the travel, all the rooms, everything. And oftentimes these are our unsung heroes, and I'd like to especially welcome them. And of course, last but not least, I recognize our members of the diplomatic community and all of you who came, who braved the heat, the humidity, and the traffic to be with us this afternoon for this historic occasion. On a personal note, I would like to recognize the presence of my wife, Alison, who often has to put up with my miserableness and nervousness when I'm organizing these events. And while we're on the subject of family, I'd like to recognize Professor Walker's mommy, who is here to support her. Thank you. As I was remarking to Sheila's mommy earlier, I said there's absolutely no way for her to deny the maternity of her daughter. I mean, if you look at both of them, I mean, it's just, no DNA test required at all. Now, next on the agenda for the lecture series, we will be having our second one next month, July 17. And that will be during the Commission's next session. And that one we are going to be having Professor Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who is an Afro-Puerto Rican. Yes. So he's coming up from Duke University. I will ensure that the notices go out very shortly. That one is going to be a little bit early, I'm afraid, to accommodate our commissioners who will be in session at that time. So it's likely to be more of a lunchtime kind of lecture, but I'm hoping that I can entice you all to come back for that one. And generally, we're hoping, the hope is, subject to resources, is that we could have at least 4 lectures a year, but again, it's subject to resources. And ultimately, the vision is that we will take the lecture series on the road, meaning we would go to different countries in the Americas, including Haiti. Let's not forget, the place of Haiti in our history. So a huge thank you to all who made this possible. So without more further ado, I bid you all good evening, thank you, and come to our next one. Thank you.